April 4th, 1968, Ella Fitzgerald was in her hotel room when the news came through the television. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot in Memphis. He was dead. Ella sat on the edge of the bed and did not move for a very long time. She had met Dr. King, not many times, not with the kind of ongoing personal relationship that some artists in the civil rights movement had maintained with him. But enough times to know that he was real, not just an idea, not just a voice on television or a name in a newspaper, but a human being of extraordinary presence and conviction. A man who used words the way she used music, to reach into people and change something. Now he was gone, shot on a balcony in Memphis at 39 years old. This is the story of what happened in the days that followed, of a call that came asking Ella to sing at a memorial tribute. Organized by the civil rights community, of her first instinct that she couldn't do it, that she had nothing left to give, that music felt insufficient and perhaps even inappropriate in the face of what had happened, of Norman Granz telling her she didn't have to, and of her changing her mind. This is the story of what it costs to sing when you're breaking, and of what Coretta Scott King said to her afterward backstage in a quiet moment that Ella carried for the rest of her life. Ella Fitzgerald had been a quiet but consistent supporter of the civil rights movement throughout her career, not a frontline activist in the mold of Harry Belafonte or Lena Horne, who had marched and organized and been publicly identified with the political struggle. Ella's contribution had been different. She'd performed at benefit concerts, donated money privately, used her prestige as one of the most respected artists in America to give events credibility and draw audiences that might not have come otherwise. But she'd also lived it, in ways that no amount of activism or benefit concert participation could fully capture. She'd experienced racism not as an abstract political issue, but as a daily reality woven through the fabric of her career. Hotels in certain cities that wouldn't take her reservation regardless of her fame. Venues that required her to enter through service doors, the same doors the cleaning staff used, while white performers walked through the front. Audiences that were segregated by force in southern venues until Norman Granz made integrated seating a non-negotiable condition of booking. She'd flown first class to Europe and performed for heads of state, and then returned to an America where in certain cities she couldn't get a table at a restaurant or a room in a hotel. She'd won Grammys and recorded with full orchestras in beautiful studios and been called the First Lady of Song by critics in every major publication. And still there were places and moments where none of that counted for anything because it didn't change the fundamental fact of what the world saw when it looked at her. She understood at the deepest possible level what Dr. King had been trying to do and why it mattered. Not from the outside, not theoretically, not from the comfortable position of someone whose life had been untouched by the injustices he was fighting. She understood it from the inside, from 4 decades of living in a country that told her in 1,000 ways that she was lesser, even as it lined up to hear her sing. When he died, something broke in the world that she'd been part of. Repairing piece by piece, note by note, performance by performance, a man who had been doing the work of making America what it claimed to be was gone at 39 on a motel balcony in Memphis. Ella felt that break personally, more personally than she would have been able to easily explain. When he died, something broke in the world. In the black community, in the civil rights movement, in the millions of people who had invested their hope in the possibility that change could come through courage and nonviolence and the persistent assertion of human dignity. Ella felt that break personally. In the days immediately following April 4th, the country was in chaos. Riots broke out in cities across America: Washington, Chicago, Baltimore, Kansas City. Over 100 cities experienced unrest in the aftermath of the assassination. The National Guard was deployed, curfews were imposed, the country was tearing at its own seams. Norman Granz canceled Ella's scheduled performances for the week. There was no question of performing under these circumstances, both practically because venues were closed and travel was complicated, and humanly because Ella was in no condition to perform. She watched the television. She made calls to people she knew. She cried. She prayed in the way she'd learned to pray growing up in a world where prayer was one of the few responses to injustice that was always available. The call came 5 days after the assassination. A senior figure in the civil rights community, someone who had worked closely with Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was organizing a memorial tribute event in Atlanta. Not the official funeral, which had already been Arranged but a separate gathering, a tribute that would bring together community members, civil rights workers, artists, and friends to honor Dr. King's memory through music and testimony. Would Ella be willing to perform? Her first response was no. It wasn't a considered no. It was a reflexive, immediate, visceral no that came from somewhere below rational thought. Music felt wrong. Standing on a stage felt wrong. The idea of performing, of using her voice for anything in the immediate shadow of Dr. King's murder felt like a category error, like bringing the wrong tools to the wrong job. She told Norman this. Norman listened carefully. He was not going to argue with her. He'd worked with Ella for 14 years by 1968, and he understood the difference between professional reluctance and genuine emotional reality. She was grieving. She had every right to decline. You don't have to, he said simply. I know, Ella said. There was a long pause. She'll be there, Norman said. He meant Coretta Scott King. Dr. King's wife would be attending the tribute. She's asked for music specifically. She said music was central to everything Martin did and to how he needs to be remembered. Ella thought about this. Music was central to everything Martin did. She knew this was true. The civil rights movement had always moved to music, the spirituals and gospel songs that had sustained Black Americans through centuries of oppression, that had been sung on marches and in churches and in jails. We shall overcome. This little light of mine ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Dr. King had understood that music wasn't decoration or entertainment. It was architecture. It built the emotional and spiritual structures inside which people could maintain their courage, their dignity, their humanity under conditions designed to strip those things away. If music was architecture, then this moment, this terrible, broken moment, needed to be built into something people could live inside. She called back within the hour. I'll do it. Norman arranged the details. The tribute was held on a warm April evening in Atlanta, in a church that had been at the center of the civil rights movement. The congregation of mourners filled the pews and spilled into the aisles, civil rights workers, community leaders, ordinary people who had marched and organized and believed in the work Dr. King had dedicated his life to. Coretta Scott King was in the front row, composed with the particular composure of someone who has made decision to hold it together for other people even while their own world has collapsed. She was 39 years old, newly widowed with 4 children, and she sat in the front row of that church with her back straight and her eyes forward and her hands folded in her lap. Ella arrived at the church before most of the mourners. She sat in a small room backstage, a room used by the choir when services were held, and tried to prepare herself. She had chosen what to sing carefully. Not the up-tempo numbers, not the jazz standards that audiences usually came to hear. She'd chosen songs that spoke to the moment. His Eye is on the Sparrow, the old gospel hymn about God's attentiveness to every creature, which had been a favorite in Black churches for generations. And We Shall Overcome, the movement's anthem, though she'd been warned that singing it might be more than the room could hold. Norman sat with her in that small room. He didn't say much. He'd learned over 14 years that Ella didn't need strategy or encouragement or pep talks before she performed. She needed to be left alone with the music, but he stayed because she'd asked him to. I don't know how to do this, Ella said quietly, not as a question, as a statement of genuine uncertainty about what was being asked of her. You know how to sing, Norman said. That's not what I mean, I know, he said, but that might be enough. Sometimes it's enough to just sing. When it was time, Ella walked to the front of the church. The mourners were quiet, the particular quiet of people who have been exhausted by grief and are now simply present in it, no longer fighting or processing, but simply enduring. She stood at the microphone. Without a band, accompanied only by a pianist who played softly, delicately, as if afraid that any excessive sound would break something, she began with His Eye is on the Sparrow. The old hymn, its message of divine attention, of the individual life mattering to God even in a universe of overwhelming forces, fell over the church like something physical. The mourners sat very still. Some of them recognized the song immediately. Others knew the melody without being able to name it. But everyone in the room felt what it was saying, that each life counted, that loss mattered, that Dr. King's death was not a statistic or an abstraction, but a wound in the fabric of something real. Ella's voice was not at its technical peak that evening. She'd been crying for 5 days. Her throat was tight from grief and tension and the accumulated weight of the The notes came from a different place than they normally did, not from the trained professional control she developed over 34 years of singing, but from somewhere deeper and less controlled, somewhere closer to the place where the music had actually originated in the first place. The gospel church, the community, the tradition of singing through impossible things because there was no alternative that left your humanity intact. In other circumstances, she might have heard this as a failure. Too ragged, too exposed, not precise enough. Count Basie had told her once that her technique was like glass, beautiful but sometimes creating distance between her and the listener. She'd spent years working to dissolve that glass. Tonight there was no glass at all. The voice that came out was the voice of a woman who was genuinely, thoroughly broken by what had happened, and who was standing at a microphone in a church in Atlanta and singing anyway because she had decided that this was what the moment required. Not a polished tribute, not a professional performance that demonstrated her abilities, just a voice making sound in the presence of grief, insisting that music still had something to offer even here, even now, even after this. She could feel the church responding. Could feel even though she couldn't see faces clearly, even though she was looking at a fixed middle distance as she always did when she was deep in a song, the collective body of the mourners moving, not physically, something less visible and more real. People were allowing something to break open that they'd been holding carefully closed since the news had come through 5 days ago. The careful composure of sustained grief giving way to something rawer and more honest, and in the front row, Coretta Scott King, who had been sitting with her back straight, composed with the ferocious dignity of a woman who knew that her composure was itself a form of testimony, had bent slightly forward, her head bowed, her shoulders no longer quite as rigid as they had been. Ella finished the hymn and let the last note dissolve into the silence. Then she began, "We Shall Overcome." She had been uncertain about this song in the days of preparation. It felt almost too much, too connected to the hope that had just been violently interrupted, too associated with the forward momentum of a movement that had just lost its most visible leader. Singing it might feel like a lie, like claiming something the present moment was offering no evidence for, but she sang it slowly, much more slowly than it was typically sung at rallies and marches, where the tempo carried people forward, kept their feet moving, sustained the physical rhythm of collective action. She sang it as a prayer, as an act of will rather than a description of fact, as the thing you say not because you're certain but because you have decided that the alternative, giving up on the possibility, is not something you can afford to do. We shall overcome. Each word landing separately with weight, requiring the room to hold it before the next one came. The church was completely still. Even the children who were present, brought by parents who felt they needed to witness this, were quiet. Coretta Scott King, in the front row, was no longer sitting with her back straight. She had bent slightly forward, her head bowed, her composure finally releasing in the presence of the music. She was not the composed widow anymore. She was a woman who had lost her husband and who was hearing a song about the possibility of something better, and it was too much and exactly the right amount simultaneously. Ella sang through to the end. When she finished, she stood for a moment at the microphone. She didn't bow, that felt wrong. She simply stood and then stepped back. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Long enough that Ella began to wonder if she had done something wrong, miscalculated, brought the wrong thing to this moment. Then the mourners began to sing, not to applaud, to sing. Voices picking up the melody she'd left hanging in the air, continuing it, adding to it, carrying it forward. We shall overcome in the throats of 100 people who had lost their leader and were choosing in this moment not to be silenced by that loss. Ella stood backstage afterward, leaning against the wall of that small choir room, entirely spent. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion but from having given something from the deepest available reserve. Norman found her there. He didn't say anything. He handed her a glass of water and stood nearby. A few minutes later, there was a gentle knock at the door. Someone from the event staff opened it. Mrs. King would like a word with Miss Fitzgerald if she's willing. Ella straightened up, smoothed her dress, said yes. Coretta Scott King came into the small room. She was not the public figure in that moment, not the movement's widow, not the composed symbol of dignified grief. She was 39 years old, dressed in black, and her eyes showed everything she'd been working to contain. She took Ella's hands in both of hers. "Thank you," she said, simply, directly, without the formal language of public appreciation. "I didn't know if I should come," Ella said. "I didn't know if I had anything useful to give." You gave exactly what was needed, Coretta said. Martin always said. She stopped for a moment, started again. He loved your music. He said you sang freedom. Ella looked at her. He said when he heard you sing, Coretta continued, he thought that's what it sounds like. That's what freedom sounds like, pure and earned and available to everyone. Ella couldn't speak. She nodded. He didn't get to hear you tonight, Coretta said, but everyone who was there will carry it, and they'll carry on the work because of moments like this one. She squeezed Ella's hands once then. Left, Ella stood alone in the small room, with the water glass Norman had handed her and the words Coretta had just spoken, and the sound of voices still faintly audible from the church, the mourners continuing to sing. She gave her voice to the civil rights movement that evening in the most literal way possible, gave it until there was nothing left in her, and then gave a little more. And what she received in return were 4 words that she would carry for the rest of her life. He said you sang freedom. That was what the work was for. That was what 34 years of developing a voice had been building toward without her knowing it. The ability to stand in a church in Atlanta on the worst day of a movement and sing, just sing, and have it mean something. She never forgot those 4 words. They were with her in 1975 when she almost retired. In 1986 when her health began seriously failing. In the recording studios of the 1980s and 1990s when her voice had changed from what it once was, but she continued recording because she still had something to say. He said you sang freedom, and so she kept singing until she couldn't anymore, because that's what freedom requires, that you keep using your voice as long as you have one, that you don't stop until you must. That you sing for the people who can no longer speak, and the people who haven't yet learned to, and the people who need to hear what a voice sounds like when it refuses to be silent. Ella Fitzgerald refused to be silent, right to the end.